Heat waves on land.
It has consequences for ocean currents.
It's changing, and it's changing before our very eyes.
What happens at the poles does affect us all. Ice shelves collapsing. We're seeing a completely astounding low in the amount of floating sea ice in the ocean at the moment in Antarctica.
Good morning, everyone. Good evening, or wherever you are, and welcome to Environmental Coffee House. And I have a special guest, Dr. Ella Gilbz, who is a polar climate scientist with the British Antarctic Survey. And I'm very excited. Welcome. So tell us about you, Ella. Everybody knows about me. This is quite exciting for us to have a young, exciting researcher who also has a YouTube channel. So let's get started. Let's hear about who are you, Ella?
Yeah, so I'm Ella. I'm a polar climate scientist at the British Antarctic Survey. I currently work on an EU project trying to predict the future of the Arctic and the Antarctic. But in my normal time, spare time, whatever I have of that, I also do a lot of communication. So I do a YouTube channel. I run a YouTube channel that I've done since 2018-ish. And then I also do lots of kind of mainstream media in the BBC, Sky, local news, national news, international news in the UK, talking about climate change, pretty much anytime it's in the news and anytime polar science is in the news. Also do a bit of documentary stuff. So trying to get the word out there about climate change and particularly the polar regions and how important they are for all of us.
They are. We are very much in tune with the Arctic regions, and that is where my partner Jennifer and I really click with our shows on what's going on. And we started with the Arctic, but recently, just in the last year, we've been doing more on the Antarctic because of the West Antarctic ice shelf and the Thwaites Glacier and the things that are happening down there and all of the speculation. So before we get into that, let's talk about you and your background and your education and why did you decide to do this as a female and a young female, which is sorely needed, really.
Well, I'm glad you think I'm still young at 31.
She's such an old lady, guys.
Yeah, I guess I started, well, go back to the beginning. I started being like super enthusiastic and enamored with being outdoors, which is kind of ironic for a kid who grew up in this inner city London. But I was always stuck halfway up a tree or splashing around in the sea on holiday or whatever. So I really loved the outdoors, always had a sense of adventure. And I guess I kind of carried that through when I went to school. Ended up getting really hooked on geography and also politics. Really, when I discovered climate change, figured that I really wanted to do something to contribute to the solutions to that problem, because I was just so enraged by the idea that climate change was so devastating to so many people and underlined all of the inequalities that were already existing in the world and kind of heightened all the injustice that was already there. So I went to the University of East Anglia. I've actually got 3 UEA degrees.
Wow.
Which is ridiculous as a statement.
It's not ridiculous. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, I went to Norwich, which is where UEA is, one of the world's, if not the world's best environmental science program. Studied there. I did a master's in climate science. I did my thesis on Antarctic temperature change and how it's related to something called the Southern Annular Mode, which is basically winds. And then after that, did a PhD. There was a lot of gaps in there as well. Like I did a lot of other kind of jobs in the middle, lots of journalism alongside as well. But that was the kind of academic step-by-step route. And I found myself at the British Antarctic Survey doing a PhD in Antarctic climate change and essentially how Antarctic climate change and ice shelves are being melted from various various mechanisms in the atmosphere. So I'm an atmospheric kind of scientist.
Absolutely. How long did it take you to do the PhD?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. Wow. And did you get
Yeah.
to travel at that time to Antarctica?
Yes. Yes, I was super lucky. I went in 2017 to Antarctica. I went, I think, to the Arctic probably 6 months later, which was it was a good year.
Yeah, I would say. Were
Seeing
these
amazing places.
and these were through the program that you were in? These trips were through the program, and how were they? I was in higher ed research, so I understand funding. So these were funded for you?
Yeah, so I think PhD funding works quite differently in North America to the way it works in Europe. In the
Okay.
UK, we have like a centralized funding arrangement. And if you get accepted to do a PhD, you have your fees and everything covered. You get a stipend, you basically get a salary, tiny one, but
Okay.
you can
It works
just
like
about
that.
live off it.
But it works like that in the States.
Yeah, and then but you do it for 3.5 years, as opposed to in the States, which is usually a lot longer. I understand.
Well, it depends on what it is and where your degree is. Sometimes
Okay.
I've seen PhDs, I do it in 2 years.
Geez Louise.
Yeah,
that is
our
big.
team member, Nicholas Humphrey, who is a meteorologist, he's doing his PhD in, well, I call it disaster management, but it's emergency management. And it'll be 2 years for him. And I think he'll have it.
Presumably he's quite qualified already.
He's qualified. I would love to have you guys on together. I don't know if you've seen Nicholas or seen his work, but you guys would be, and he's also young. You know, I think he's 39. So yes, I like to surround myself with young people. You are the future. You are the future. So tell, when you were doing the PhD and you did the studying, what kinds of activities were you doing, particularly in Antarctica?
So I'm a climate modeler primarily, which means that I spend a lot of time staring at computer screens writing code. But
Wow.
when I do go to places like Antarctica or anywhere else, we're looking at things like clouds, we're looking at weather patterns. I did lots of time doing weather observation whilst I was in Antarctica. So releasing weather balloons to measure the full atmosphere, helping with some of the airborne observations, which we have. Basically, we have a teeny tiny little aircraft that flies around measuring clouds and the atmosphere and stuff like that, which is a really phenomenal experience to be part of. And that's the kind of thing we would measure. I mean, these days, you know, research evolves over time. I think I'd be more
Absolutely.
interested in also that clouds are a big enthusiasm for me. I think that will never
That's
go away. But
We could
yeah, other
learn
things
from
like
you.
clouds,
We could definitely learn because clouds are something, and Jennifer and I always say, we need to study clouds a lot more than we have. So here's somebody right here in front of me, even though you're in the UK, who knows clouds. So maybe we can link what is with clouds and our changing climate. Are clouds changing as the climate changes from global warming?
yes, is the short answer. But the long answer is that they're changing in very different and complicated and interacting ways.
Wow.
So the thing about clouds and climate is more about the fact that clouds are the number one source of uncertainty. So the number one question mark in our predictions of future climate change, because the way we predict the future is with models. And because clouds are so complicated, because they are so hard to measure, because they are so transient, it means that we cannot put them in models very well because they're too complicated. And it means that because they impact how much energy is received at the surface of the planet, for example, that can have a very strong effect on how much warming we see at the surface and how that goes into the future as well. So we've got lots of different competing impacts, because clouds can have a different effect based on where they are in the atmosphere, if they're very high or very low, what they're made of, whether it's mostly ice, mostly liquid, what temperature they're at, what season it is, what surface they're on top of, if they're over sand or ocean or ice, for example. All of those things make a big difference. How thick they are, all of those things can have a very profound impact on the effect they have at the surface, and therefore their climate effect. So climate change is changing all of those properties, which means that it's also changing how they respond to climate change. So it's this like very complicated loop with clouds, this mysterious wispy entity in the middle.
Do clouds pick up the particulate matter in smoke, let's say, or sulfur from ships? Do all those things make clouds?
So those little particles that you're talking about, we would call aerosols.
Yes, the aerosols.
And aerosols like that would be they kind of trigger the formation of different kind of clouds in different kinds of situations. So sulfur dioxide has been talked about a lot recently because of this new shipping rule that's just been brought in to eliminate sulfur dioxide emissions, which has had this kind of counterintuitive effect of reducing the amount of clouds over the ocean, because there's fewer sulfur dioxide particulates in the atmosphere to trigger the formation of clouds. And those clouds actually have a cooling effect on the surface, which means warming has been amplified. And this is what I think James Hansen has talked about, in the sense that 2023 has been really, really warm, and he's linking this in some way to that. You can have dust, you can have sea salt, you can have blowing snow particles, you can have sulfur dioxide, you can have black carbon from burning fossil fuels. All of these can act as aerosols to seed clouds, and they all have slightly different effects.
So what have you seen from the garbage that's picked up by clouds that's dumped in Antarctica? Is it as awful as we read about? Can you actually see the effects of what clouds are bringing to the ground, to the ice, to the snow?
It's a bit outside my field, but I mean, from what I understand from colleagues, I mean, Antarctica is not as pristine as it used to be, for sure. I mean, we're finding microplastics in the Antarctic. We're finding evidence of, I mean, the whole planet is so interconnected, you can't expect Antarctica to remain completely isolated from the effects of fossil fuel burning forever. The Arctic is, of course, way closer to huge centers of pollution, because the Northern Hemisphere has way more big industrial centers in it than the Antarctic, which is pretty cut off by this very, complete circumpolar ocean and this very strong wind current that exists around the edges. So yeah, it's definitely, we're starting to see the effects of human activity in Antarctica.
How about the Arctic? Tell us about that trip.
So I've been to the Arctic twice now. The first one wasn't very long. We were again releasing weather balloons and measuring the atmosphere.
Well, somebody's got to do it, Ella.
Somebody's got to do it. Yeah, we took one for the team there, going to one of the most incredible places on Earth. More recently, I went to Svalbard, which was a really amazing trip. That was to film a documentary called Lift the Ice, which is actually available in North America. So you can watch it on Curiosity Stream over there if you're interested.
Oh, we're interested.
It's a really fantastic series. It follows 6 different host scientists on a quest to kind of uncover the secrets of the ice. And I might be biased, but honestly, it's such a great series. Please watch it if you can. It's not available in Europe, which is really annoying.
That's weird. Why is that?
I don't know. They just didn't sell it to a distributor yet that is available in Europe, but it's just been shortlisted for an award, so it is genuinely very good. So I'd recommend to any of your.
Well, I think science communication is extremely important, and as you've said, in the female realm, it is more critical because we need to talk to each other. We need to get rid of the old patriarchal, oh, it's a climate scientist, so it's a dude. And of course, we've made a lot of inroads, but someone like you is going to make huge inroads for other young women, young people who want to go into the field and say, oh, I want to emulate her and what she's doing, which is fantastic. Fantastic, especially the science communication. How did that start?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so, because I mean, in the UK at least, there's very, very few. There's no one talking about climate change on TV really, and there's certainly very few female scientists. There's a couple now, but it's definitely a much more male-dominated field. And in my experience, academia in general, science in general, and particularly polar science is very white. It's very male. It skews quite old, and that needs to change. You need to have diversity to be able to appreciate the full range of ideas and innovation from the whole of society. So trying to change one small section of that.
That's great. When I was in my career as a higher ed research administrator, we were very much into the STEM projects and bringing people, a diverse cadre of people, into all the STEM programs. And I'm hoping that is still the case. You're sitting here as a testament to that for the UK. Anyway, have you been here to the States?
No.
Oh, good. You're not missing anything.
I've got family in Canada, so I've been there a lot.
Okay. Well, if you ever get to the States, you have to look me up. Definitely, if you have relatives in Canada. But anyway, we're going off a little bit. Can we get back to, I'd like to get back to the aerosol and the aerosol effect and your thoughts about the future of the, as we were talking about clouds and the aerosol effect. Could you explain what that is a little bit more? The aerosol effect, and do you feel that it's actually a big problem not to have the sulfur in the air or not to have that happening?
So, yeah, to explain this, we have to go back to a little bit of cloud physics. Mm-hmm. So aerosols act, I said before, they're these little particles, they're tiny in the atmosphere. They act like a kind of seed. So when we make a cloud, you need 3 ingredients, or 2 strictly, but 3 in practice. So you need cooling and you need some kind of water. So you have to have enough water in the atmosphere, and it needs to be cold enough for that water to be present as either a liquid droplet or an ice crystal. And if you have an aerosol, that whole process can happen at much warmer temperatures, which means that it can practically occur all the time. So that means you can get clouds occurring at a normal kind of atmospheric temperature of -10, for example, instead of it having to be -38, which is really cold. So those aerosols trigger the formation of clouds. And because a lot of in general, on balance across the whole world, you can kind of average out the whole effect of clouds. Clouds at high altitude tend to have a warming effect. Okay. So those are like what we call cirrus. It's the kind of clouds at aircraft height. Mm-hmm. And then lower level clouds tend to have a different effect. So that's why when we have sulfur dioxide added to the atmosphere, they trigger these marine clouds, which are close to the surface, which have a cooling effect. Okay. Therefore, having fewer sulfur dioxide emissions impacts the warming by removing that kind of normal cooling effect that was present. So having less environmental pollution in this instance has a detrimental effect on the rate of climate warming. Wow. Whether it's good or not, I think is a thornier question, because it's more about whether we think human activity changing our environment is, good or not. It's essentially geoengineering.
It is. So, what do you see in the future, short term future, and then the long term future in this arena with this aerosol masking effect issue?
I don't know too much about the way it will go. It's not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about.
All right.
There's lots of people suggesting we put more aerosols into the atmosphere to manufacture a masking effect. But I think that's a dangerous path to go down, because then you constantly have to do it forever and ever and ever. And that's not very practical to commit to. I think what would be way better is just to stop making the problem worse and to actually start making the problem less bad by reducing emissions and then producing some way of sucking out CO2 from the atmosphere, whether that's by rewilding or amplifying natural carbon sinks, or at last resort using artificial carbon dioxide removal.
Right, which is what I know the United States is dumping a bunch of money into that. And the carbon capture schemes, carbon capture companies. And I think it's just, well, I feel maybe that's a little bit too much right now. I don't know if it even works. What's the future of that? I love rewilding. I like anything that's natural that could bring us back into some kind of homeostasis, if it's possible. Do you think it's possible?
Sure. I mean, anything is possible. It's just about the will to do it and the actual practical application of that will. I think the thing about carbon dioxide removal technologies, artificial ones as opposed to trees, for example, they should be a last resort. They should be the kind of the last bit that tidies up the final bit of fossil fuel emissions that we cannot get rid of any other way. And the steps that come before that, most importantly, is reducing the amount of emissions we're putting into the atmosphere, because then there's less to tidy up in the first place. So that has to be one of the primary focuses. And then after that, we can take other approaches to absorb carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, like enhancing natural wilderness and natural sinks of carbon. And then finally, then we can start putting into practice some of these more artificial approaches.
And the artificial approaches are favored by the fossil fuel industry, and they have a lot of investment in carbon capture. I think in the future, these techno people would probably like to see everybody's house have a carbon capture on their furnace so they can continue to burn fossil fuels. That's controversial, but I see it.
Sure, I think, I mean, I like to think of myself as a techno person, but also a different kind of techno.
Different. You're not out there working for a fossil fuel company that wants to continue to do it. No.
That was just a joke about my terrible music taste.
Oh, really? Do you have terrible music taste? I can't even imagine that. Come on.
No, I think the thing about all of this is, the 1.5 degree future. All of the model scenarios that allow us to get to 1.5 degrees assume huge amounts of negative carbon technologies, i.e. carbon removal from the atmosphere. And they kick in like 27 years' time. So it feels incredibly unrealistic to assume that that's going to be market ready, let's say, by that time. And also how that's going to be practical. At the same time as, of course, dramatically reducing emissions. Also makes huge assumptions about population, which don't seem to be realized in the real world. In fact, population is going in the opposite direction to the way that the 1.5 degree scenarios assume. So there's a lot of kind of underlying assumptions in the way that we project the future that are not immediately explicit.
Wow. So in other words, all of these companies that are, let's say, going to COP28, if there is one, given the world situation and everything that's happening, COP28, all of the companies that go there, it's a trade fair. They're all there marketing their wares for carbon removal, and there's We Don't Have Time, who is the organization. I think they're in Norway. I'm not sure, but they do all kinds of technical solutions, and they talk about it. Do we have time?
Time for what? There's always time. It's never too late to take action, right?
No, I believe that
makes a difference. I am highly skeptical we'll ever get to 1.5. Highly skeptical we'll get to 2. I think that we have time to adapt to changes that are committed. I think that we have time to make it less bad for future generations and for ourselves. It's inevitably we're going to see more changes for the worse. But also the benefits of taking climate action extend way beyond climate change. You know, if we make a better world for ourselves in the doing of it, then that's great. You know, if we have better health and well-being, better, more restored ecosystems, we have less biodiversity loss, we have more livable cities, and all of those things that come along with taking climate action, then that's of an obvious benefit as well. So I think we do have time to do better things, but I think we have to be realistic about the outcomes and the goals.
So you don't think that we are at 1.5? We're at like a 1.2 at this point?
Currently, we're at 1.2 degrees on average, yeah.
Okay. And what's stopping us? What is stopping the planet from going whoop, up?
Well, nothing at the moment.
Okay. All right.
We keep putting fossil fuels into the atmosphere, and we keep inputting the kind of we've still got our foot on the gas pedal.
Oh, we do. And
we are not. Yeah, we're not changing that. We're not breaking, and that's the problem.
And that's a big problem politically around the world. People are skeptical. They don't believe it, or the governments, it's a gravy train. Fossil fuels are a gravy train. They don't believe that. Governments don't believe that people can go without it. And then there's countries that want what the Western countries have and say, well, why shouldn't we have what you have? How do we get around that, where there's a worldwide equality, if there is ever such a thing?
This is a very big problem, and that's what this argument about the loss and damage fund at COP is all about. So these climate summits are really hinging on the discussion of how we redistribute funds, essentially, to account for historical responsibility for climate change and to allow developing countries to continue to develop and enjoy the same standards of living as industrialized nations have for many decades, centuries. And that is a really, really critical mechanism that has to be addressed. And it looks like things are again falling behind, which is perhaps unsurprising.
Yeah.
I was at COP27 last year, and it felt so frustratingly slow. It felt really, I think, you mentioned this idea of it being like a trade fair. It did feel very much like that. And I suspect that COP28 in the UAE is going to be very much the same.
Oh my gosh.
There's a lot of kind of delaying tactics as a kind of complement to the denial and the doomism. There's also this climate delay, which is doing no one any favors, ultimately, apart from the people who are profiting from the whole debacle.
Oh, well, profit. Isn't that what makes the world go round? It is a profit center. The planet is a profit center. And so you won't be going to COP28 if they have one, if they end up having one?
I shan't be going to COP28.
No. So you were at 27. What was your experience as far as your academically while you went? And where were you during that?
Yeah, so I went as part of an initiative. Basically, they had a cryosphere pavilion. So it was to communicate polar science.
Mm-hmm.
And it was more about communicating than to, do any research myself. So it was about sharing and doing some outreach and connection with other folks there, trying to have some impact on the policy. I actually made a video about it, which is on my YouTube channel.
How did I
And I
miss
found
that? Oh my gosh. How in the
Yeah.
world did I miss it? Because there's 100 million other things, and I am sorry because I will watch that today.
It was really hard. I found it really hard. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done.
Wow.
Found it infuriating, frustrating, really demoralizing. Um, and I mean, we need to have these climate summits, but they are just not working. They are not fit for purpose. And it's because it's like the perfect example of how much we as humanity are dragging our feet, and how there are certain people who are already being so affected. It's the small island developing states, it's developing countries who are bearing the brunt of climate change already on the front lines.
Absolutely.
They are the ones crying out for a legally binding 1.5 degree target. They are the ones crying out for a well-funded, legally binding loss and damage fund. And then it's all the big likely suspects, you would imagine, who are going, no, I don't like your wording. Can we change this? And, throwing spanners in the works just to make things move slowly and to kind of muddy their efforts. And it's just exactly as you would imagine. And that's really disheartening.
Of course it is. All the money that the Western hemisphere throws at wars, and well, everybody, throws at wars and conflict. Can you imagine just taking that and fulfilling that obligation of the Council of the Parties to bring equality? Did you get to meet Mia Motley, by the way, at all?
No, that would be nice.
She inspires me, Dr. Motley. Oh, well, I don't know if but she is inspiring, Mia Motley, and all the people that are from these smaller countries really are inspiring because they're so genuine, and they don't seem to have been spoiled by what we in the Western countries that are so advanced. They just don't seem to be as spoiled as we are, and they take everything much more seriously. And I believe that their populations of these people are not as jaded and angry, or maybe not as blinded by social media. And that's a good segue, because you are young and you've grown up in the age of social media. Can you discuss for you, as a climate scientist, what you see social media's positives and negatives? Obviously, you're doing something positive. I'm doing something positive. Well, let's hear about what your thoughts are.
I think social media used to be a really powerful tool for communication. Still is. But I think its kind of dominance in society at large has sullied its kind of positive in some ways. When I first joined Twitter, which apparently is 7 years ago today, says Twitter.
Oh boy. So I give you an applause.
Yeah, please. It was such a great way to meet people, to make connections. Like, I've met real people in real life via Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
I've got jobs through Twitter. I've, it's such an amazing tool to share the amazing research that we're doing and to democratize information. And that's the thing I think about the internet, because YouTube is an incredible platform to democratize information. I don't think that I, as a climate scientist, have any right to hold back the information from anyone else. And I think, in fact, rather than, it's my duty to communicate the science, to communicate the research to people in a way that everyone can understand, because I'm taxpayer funded. I have the privilege of being paid to do research, and it is therefore my responsibility to finish that research by communicating it not just to my peers, not just to the funders,
Right.
but also to everybody.
To
And I
us,
actually think
me.
yeah, exactly. The social media is such a powerful way of doing that, and anyone has access to anything. That's really fundamentally quite revolutionary, and that's really great. The negatives of it are that anyone can chime in, despite the fact that they don't have to declare any agendas. They don't have to declare any conflict of interest. They don't have to declare who funds them. They don't have to declare, what's going on. People, there are bots, there are page shills, there are people who are like maliciously spreading denial,
Yes.
delay, doom, all of these things just to whip up a kind of frenzy or to manufacture like a climate of doubt
Yes,
around the
absolutely.
science. And that is, yeah, it's kind of like what Naomi Klein talks about in her Merchants of Doubt book.
Amazing
And
book.
it's also completely polarizing, right?
Hmm.
So the big social media platforms thrive off people fighting, and that is not a good way to communicate information that requires collective action. And it pushes us into our own corners of the internet, and we've seen this hugely in the last few years. The election scandals and the
Oh,
association with
gosh.
Facebook and Twitter and all of these huge platforms, and it's the Wild West out there, and
Yeah, there
that
you go.
polarization is affecting society at large, not just society on social media. So whilst it can be a really profoundly powerful tool to communicate, you have to be very aware of the limitations, because it's also really tough out there, and
Uh-huh.
it's getting increasingly tough.
I read comment sections, and I've often thought I could just do a PhD myself examining comment sections on social media and breaking down as you just described, the different types of commenters. It would be,
Say
it's a
this.
study in
I know
itself.
someone doing a PhD on exactly
You're
this.
kidding. Well, that person is, it interests me. If I was ever going to go back to school, which I'm not, but I would probably do something in that social sphere. Although I love science, I am not a scientist per se, but this is really interesting to me. And being that you are so young and you see this, and I don't want to keep harping on the age group, but you have a purpose and a function with this communication, just like you said, taxpayer funded. It's almost like you feel like it's an obligation to be able to communicate. So how do you combat the comment sections or the people that you hear from that are, and not the echo chamber of people that agree with you, but how do you combat those that continually might assault you in a comment section? Do you bother? Or do you just let it ride?
No, mostly I delete them, because a lot of them are not genuine. And also, I don't want someone to come to one of my videos and see all of this like nonsense that
Right.
is just absolute nonsense. Occasionally, someone will put something that is vaguely sensible, and in that case, I will
Vaguely.
engage in a conversation. I think my opinions about engaging with deniers has changed a little
Hmm.
bit. I used to be of the opinion that, like, if you can present this logical, coherent argument, you may not convince the person themselves, but you're convincing the people who are silently watching around the edges. That requires a lot of
Yeah.
time, dedication, patience, and also keeping your head. And now I think it's not worth my time or energy or like
Right.
emotion. It takes a lot out of you to be able to do that. These days, I am more likely to save up the most nonsensical and mad ones and make silly videos about them.
Yeah. There you go. There you go. Seriously, I mean, I've seen some of your comment sections and people are just, and even if they are people, but if they're not people, what are they? Tell me, what is a bot? I mean, you're a YouTuber, but what is a bot? We have a very small channel. I don't get thousands of views. We don't even get that many trolls. Seriously, we're off the radar. What is a bot? How does it work?
I mean, I don't really know, but certainly on Twitter and also Instagram and
Uh-huh.
TikTok and I think you must get the same sort of people on YouTube on YouTube as well. Like it's a programmatically designed account that will write the same sort of things to sow doubt on specific channels. It's algorithmically designed.
Yeah.
It's
like a job. Somebody could be 100 people.
And a lot of them, like some are maybe people who are just, they have an agenda or they're paid to do so. I don't know. Others are people that have bought into climate denial.
Sure.
And those are the people that you want to try and convince if you can, but also you're not going to convince everybody. The ones that I'm really talking to are the ones that are down the middle, who don't really care either way or who aren't convinced either way. Mm-hmm. That's where I see my impact being the largest, because sure, it's nice to get comments from people within your echo chamber who are saying, great video, I love what you're doing. Or, you know, I go on one of the kind of lefty media outlets and someone's like, great, loved your interview about climate change. And it's like, well, I was preaching to the choir there. What I find more useful is going on a really mainstream, middle of the road outlet and talking to people who might not consider it to be an important issue and convincing them, just tipping the scales very slightly in one direction so that they start thinking about it more. And that's where I think the most impact has to be had.
I'd love to see you on Fox, but I don't know if they would. Well,
I've done a UK equivalent of Fox, and it was hard work.
Really? What kinds of questions did they ask you?
It's just like really relentless badgering about really tangential points that they think are like a gotcha. It was actually at COP27 last year where I did quite a combative interview, you might say.
No kidding.
With the host just kind of relentlessly pushing me on this like really niche like angle on something I said, and she just wouldn't drop it, which is classic.
So you've got to really wear some body armor with these people. Yep. Just let them throw it at you and it'll eventually blow up in their faces. But when? When?
Well, will it? I don't know. I hope so.
Yeah, but with your communication and Climate Adam as well, I think that it's a very positive step. And why don't we go and segue a little bit into how that happened and how you guys got together to communicate?
Yeah, so Adam and I first met a really long time ago, actually, I think we kind of first connected via YouTube. And we were both living in London at the time, so we went for a drink in the pub. Actually turned out we lived super close to each other, which is one of those universal serendipities, I guess. And then Adam moved to Berlin. We did a few collaborations kind of over the internet, if you like. Yeah. And then when I went to Berlin, I went to hang out with Adam and we did this collaboration in person, which was really fun. And yeah, it's been a fun friendship that's developed.
That's nice.
Adam's a great communicator, really brilliant.
That he is.
And would really recommend anyone who doesn't follow the Climate Adam channel to go and subscribe immediately.
Yes, absolutely.
He is brilliant.
I think probably our followers might, but a lot are bringing in new people all the time. And so this is really a really timely, very important discussion you and I are having, because there are so many people that all of these things, Antarctic is never, ever on the radar. It's never something that they think about and people think about, and it's okay. I don't blame them, but it is so critical to our future to understand what's happening at the poles. North Pole, South Pole, as if you want to put it like that, where Santa Claus lives. But honestly, it's a really great endeavor that you have taken. And I see that your channel and your work has taken off. How do you find the time between your actual, you're laughing because I understand time is always a precious commodity. So how do you find the time for your YouTube endeavors, for your research? How does it all work for you?
I don't have any free time. That's the answer. I make YouTube videos in my weekends and evenings, and I work like an absolute dog.
So
Unfortunately,
give us a day in the life of Dr. Gilbz.
a day in the life. The thing is, it varies so much. Like I have a very full-time job, which is
Yes.
actually probably more than one full-time job,
Wow.
because that's academia for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Oh, yeah.
I work on that a lot, and then on the weekends or around the edges in the mornings occasionally, or the evenings, I would write scripts for new videos. I'd research ideas, I'd edit, and then I'd film on the weekends. Yeah,
It's
it's
great.
just whenever I can find a spare moment, really.
Sure.
Um,
But this is it's important. So you go into the office, the lab. Well, tell us, where do you work and what happens during your day? I mean, people are always inquisitive about the guest.
so I work in Cambridge, which is an hour train ride from London. Most of the time I work from this chair right here.
Okay.
Maybe like 3 days a week I work from home, and then I go to the office twice a week, something like that. Most of my work is writing code, running models.
Wow.
So it's all computery. And occasionally I deviate into the task of writing all the research up. So it's, analysis of the science, the figures, the kind of the data itself, and then turning that into something that makes sense to other people.
So tell us about your team, the team that you work with, and how they interact, and how is it funded research from where? If you're doing something specific.
I'm 100% employed by an EU project, which is called PolarRes, and the idea is that we're kind of projecting into the future for the Arctic and the Antarctic using, they're called storylines, but it's basically, instead of fossil fuel scenarios, we're using scenarios that have more physical meaning. So if the sea ice declines a lot, what does that do to climate change? Or if you have strengthening storm tracks, what does that do to climate change in the Arctic? So things like this that have a kind of more tangible impact, and then trying to use those to project the real terms impacts on people. So how that might influence wildfires or permafrost, or how it might affect marine biodiversity and ecosystems, fisheries in the southern hemisphere, things like that. And this project is an EU project, so it's got 13 different EU partners from across Europe. So
Great.
everyone's very distributed, and we're sharing the workloads. It's all modeling, so it's all very cutting edge modeling techniques. We're using very high resolution modeling, which is kind of taking a magnifying glass to the sorts of models that have normally been used to project into the future. And within the British Antarctic Survey, there's a team of people all working on slightly different kind of angles on the same question. Some are doing much more kind of technical, fine scale, in the details work to figure out how clouds and aerosols interact, for example, or how sea ice is changing. Whereas mine is a little bit more broad, because I'm thinking about the next 100 years, which is, of course, you can't be quite so kind of nitty gritty with that. But yeah, we're all doing different flavors of the same sort of thing. And ultimately it will end up in hopefully some very useful outputs.
Absolutely. Now, you say the next 100 years. How do you deal with the people that are so determined to say that's it, and almost putting your work and saying it's useless? How do you deal with that? Because
I find this almost as difficult as denial, actually, and it's an increasingly obvious problem. Not necessarily because I disagree. Obviously, it comes from a good place for most people. It's just a place of fear. They know it's important, climate change. They know they usually care very deeply about the natural world. But I think as a scientist, my job is to take an objective measure of all the available evidence. And I think also the definition of doomer has to be clarified, because my definition of doomer is someone who, it's basically nihilism, right? It's there's nothing we can do, we're doomed, there's no point in taking any action. And actually, I don't think that's a helpful attitude, because there's always a benefit to taking action. Every 1/10 of a degree of warming we can avoid is going to be beneficial, and it will have tangible impacts on saving lives, saving livelihoods, and saving the environment. So those kinds of dismissive attitudes, I think, it buys into the narrative of delay and of denial. Actually, that's why I put them in the same ballpark, because it doesn't achieve anything good. But I understand completely where people are coming from, because mainstream media will cherry pick specific studies and say, we're all going to die by 2050 because this study says so. And actually, if you read the study itself, it didn't say 2050. It didn't say we're all going to die.
I don't think you can put a number on anything. I think, to me,
it's partly reporting, it's partly the limitations of what we can say scientifically, it's partly a misunderstanding of the way that scientists tend to talk about uncertainty and what we do know and what we don't know, and also the kind of techniques that we have available. It's a really difficult question, and one I don't have the answer to. But I do find the proliferation of like extremely doomist rhetoric quite alarming. Not just because it says lots about people's mental health and where they're at with it, which is worrying. I find myself increasingly anxious and alarmed and scared about the future. But I think, in fact, I just published a video that I spoke to the author of a pretty bleak new paper about the West Antarctic. And she wrote an incredible article that said, we don't need hope, we need courage. Because hope isn't appropriate in this context, because there is no hope to save the West Antarctic. But we can take courage, and courage looks like taking measures to adapt, taking grown-up, measured actions to deal with what we've done, to take responsibility, essentially, and to be brave in the face of bad news.
That's what I was going to say.
And that's the kind of approach that I think I'm going to try and keep in mind more of, like courage instead of clinging to false hope.
I like that. I like that a lot. And you could send me a link if you could. That would be great for that. Absolutely. I think that is somewhere a lot of us, it's courage. And for scientists, climate scientists especially, you've got to have that. You've got to have courage. You've got to be brave, because you are going in uncharted territory. You are seeing some of the most frightening statistics in your work, I am sure, and in the collaborations. So I give you a lot of kudos for what you are doing, and for what all the other climate scientists that are out there are doing, so that people like me can understand. People like me, that follow us, can understand what's happening and why is it important. And it is so important. It is so important. And I'm thinking about my daughter, who I send your videos to, because she's probably somebody who would never really consciously think about what's happening in the Antarctic or the Arctic. But when you mention penguins, or you mention the chicks and what happened there, that's something that gets a lot of people's attention. The animals and the reaction to. Can you bring a little bit about that into play, since you were there?
Yeah, I mean, well, I wasn't there when all the penguin colonies were lost, but penguins tend to have these big colonies around on the edge of sea ice, and the fact that we've had, since 2016, we've had really record low Antarctic sea ice, and in fact this year was just off the charts, crazy low, and lots of penguins just completely failed to breed in those years, and that means those populations are, for all intents and purposes, extinct in that particular location. So that's really devastating for those particular animals, but also for the population of penguins across the whole continent. Because if that starts happening every year, then that's going to have a real profound impact on those animals. Obviously, they can change their behavior, but how quickly will that happen?
Right.
So yeah,
Adaptation.
penguins are suffering, but also it shouldn't just be about the cute animals. It should be about the effects that it has on all of us. I think that's the thing
absolutely.
that people don't necessarily understand, that actually the polar regions feel very distant, but they do have an effect on all our lives.
Oh, we had a meme for years that said, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. That perhaps that was one of the first types of little environmental coffee house memes we put out, because it doesn't. And it is so important to understand these. And I want to thank you and give you so much credit for this endeavor you are on, because it is critically important. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to tell us what you feel is the most important thing. What are the most important things for us to understand, those of us that are going to watch this video, and where we should go for more information, or why?
Oh, that's hard. The most important bits. I guess the polar regions do affect all of our lives. They're not at the end of the earth. I mean, they are, but they're also impacting the weather, the climate, everything. They're so central to the global climate, and therefore so central to all of our lives. So we can't forget about protecting them. And if you want to know more about the polar regions, you should check out my YouTube channel.
And the link will be in the show notes, as always. As always. Dr. Gilbz, I hope that this is one of many, because I very much enjoyed this discussion. I think we covered quite a bit, but I know there's always more.
There's always more, yeah. Thanks for a great discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much.